Good evening, everyone. I am Raquel Willis, the Director of Communications for the Miss Foundation for Women, and I am excited to welcome you to the fourth program in Women and Power, a conversation series brought to you by the Brooklyn Historical Society and, of course, the Miss Foundation. So we started this series really to honor and acknowledge a historical feat. 100 years ago, the 19th Amendment granted white women the right to vote, but not women of color and many other women. To mark this unfinished moment, we come together to continue shining a spotlight on gender and racial inequality today. If you are returning, we are so glad to have you back. And if this is your first time joining us, you are in for another special night as we focus on caregiving power. This conversation will focus on the changing nature of care. What do our societal expectations dictate about who our caregivers are? How do these expectations intersect with experiences of identity? And how has this relationship with a caregiver's gender affected the value that we place on the labor of care? So yes, you're getting a twofer tonight because we can't talk about care without also talking about labor. And for this conversation, we have three powerful guests. First up, Adrienne Marie Brown is an activist, writer, and doula. Adrian is the author of Pleasure Activism, The Politics of Feeling Good, Emergent Strategy, Shaping Change, Changing Worlds, and the co-editor of Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction from Social Justice Movements. She is also the co-host of How to Survive the End of the World and Octavia's Parables. Both of these powerful, amazing podcasts. Check them out. And Adrian is rooted in Detroit. Next, we have Alexis McGill Johnson. She was recently named the permanent president after a year of serving as acting president and CEO for Planned Parenthood Federation of America, and is a former member of the board of Planned Parenthood Action Fund, as well as a former chair and member of the board. She is also a renowned social justice leader, acclaimed researcher and strategist, a lifelong political organizer, and of course, a tireless advocate for reproductive rights and access to quality, affordable healthcare. In less than a year as acting president, she has undertaken the deep work of building trust within Planned Parenthood and across the movement for sexual and reproductive rights. And last, of course, but not least, born in South Africa and raised in the United States, we have Premilla Nadasen, who is a professor of history at Barnard College and Columbia University. She is most interested in visions of social change and the ways in which poor and working class women of color have fought for social justice. She has published extensively on the multiple meanings of feminism, alternative labor movements, and grassroots community organizing. Nadasen has been engaged with community and campus activism for many years and has built bridges between those inside and outside of the academy. I'm sure she will do some of that tonight. She is the author of 2 award-winning books, Welfare Warriors, The Welfare Rights Movement in the United States, and Household Workers Unite, the untold story of African-American women who built a movement. She is also currently working on a biography of South African singer and anti-apartheid activist, Miriam Makeba. Welcome all. How are y'all doing tonight?
Hey.
Thank you for having us, Raquel.
Great to see all of you.
Of course. So we're here on another hump day night, and of course we are, I'm sure, in the afterglow, or if you want to call it that, of last night's U.S. presidential debate. And so I'm sending you all powerful vibes, and I think that it makes so much sense that we are talking about care and labor, and of course lifting up the voices of women. So I want to start us off really and kind of breaking down how we frame and discuss care in our society. How do you all believe that gender and identity writ large affects the value that we place on the labor of care?
So I think gender is absolutely central to how we understand care, both unpaid care work and paid care work. Care work, and I think when we say care work, we're talking about a whole range of different things. So on the one hand, I think care work refers to the work we do in our home, the unpaid labor of care, taking care of our children, cooking, cleaning the household, but it also refers to largely female occupations, so nursing, teaching, and domestic work as well. And I think both when you look at the unpaid labor as well as the paid labor, there's a devaluation of that work. We don't recognize it for what it's worth. We don't recognize how important it absolutely is for human survival. And I think that's one of the things that has come out in this pandemic, right, is the ways in which we all depend on the care work that supports us as individuals and supports us as families.
Yeah, what I would love to add to that, Premilla, is just the ways in which, you know, our brains and our bodies actually respond to caregivers, right? That, you know, we know that when for most of us, and particularly folks who identify as women, gender is the thing that is noticed about us. When race intersects with gender, it actually trumps our it trumps our understanding of gender and creates a different kind of explanation. And I think that for caregivers, they are literally living at that intersection of invisibility. And it impacts how we see and think and create policies that support those caregivers. So when I think about just during the pandemic, we have had, you know, essential workers. Our bodies were literally deemed essential. Getting on the subways, we were going and, you know, taking care in nursing homes and hospitals. We were taking care inside of a lot of our public sectors, and yet the gendered notion of the care, right, which is largely aggregated to what we consider feminine identities, as well as the racial component, really regarded or disregarded an entire caregiving community as invisible, and the impact that had on, as we know now, on folks who are more susceptible to getting COVID, I think is really impactful. So thinking about kind of through that race and gender lens, and how, you know, what we call intersectional invisibility shows up with respect to care, is really something that we have to interrogate.
Y'all smart. We good. We're gonna have a good conversation tonight. So the thing that I would toss in is I get really interested about how gender is constructed, and gender keeps being constructed, and care has been socialized into what women do. It's women's work. And I actually think a part of what we're experiencing right now is the way a society breaks down when care is gendered in that way, when it's like, oh, care is just women's work. It's something that we give to those we think of as secondary, right? That society has historically held as secondary, and care it's a secondary work. It's something that people do for those in privilege. And I think right now we see the crisis of what it looks like when care is held both devalued because women are devalued, and then put to the side as a secondary work or something that only has to happen in a crisis. And so right now, I feel like we're months into this upending of the world where everything is being unveiled, including who gets care and who doesn't get care, and how does our nation understand and prioritize care. which right now it just doesn't, right? So all of us, so many people have had to take on the labor of caring beyond our capacity, caring beyond our means, caring beyond beyond any logic. Like, I know so many women right now who are just like, I don't sleep, or I don't eat, or I don't do this because the amount of care that I'm expected to give in so many directions at one time is so overwhelming and impossible, and yet it must be done. It is essential, and it's not essential necessarily as paid work. That's one aspect of what's happening. But what I have been blown away by is how much care people are having to do now in their homes to cover for every aspect of society, because care is necessary in education, care is necessary in health, care is necessary in relationship, in movement, which is the space that I sit in. Is I'm trying to hold like the relationships inside of movement, and I'm like, who's making sure that we care for each other inside of a crisis where we have to be strategizing constantly as well? So it's, yeah, tense times.
Now, do you feel, Adrian, that we have turned some kind of corner in terms of having a more equitable conversation, just in what we've learned during this pandemic?
I think there's no us, right? Like, I don't think there's a monolithic us. I think that's one of the other pieces that is interesting to me, is those who provide and give and think about care. There's a whole population of folks who I feel like are being given more space, more time, more attention within movement. There's been more attention to, we have to care for ourselves, right? We hear Audre Lorde quoted all the time, caring for ourselves is political warfare. There's more of that orientation. But I also think there's just as many people who are like, we don't have time for that. There's still so much energy of like, we need to put it to the back burner and we need to press on. And I keep uplifting the work of the NAP ministry, Tricia Hershey, because she talks about, in order to really care for each other and ourselves in this moment, we have to stop acting as if anything is normal. And there's a way that we can care and it can uphold normalcy. Like, oh, we'll use care to plug the gaps and like be the glue. And it's like, oh, how do we care for each other without pretending like things are normal or upholding these systems of injustice? Which is one of the things I'm excited to get into tonight. It's just like, yes, the care work we're doing is, the vision I hold is for a future in which care is the central organizing principle of how we are with each other. We have a long way to go, and it's made up of many small steps and relinquishing some of the martyrdom that is currently associated with the caregiver.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And I don't know if anyone else wanted to add to that one as well. Just, do you think we've turned a corner here? Or and how would you define that we, just as Adrian was speaking to?
Yeah, I really agree with a lot of what both Adrian and Alexis have said. I think, in terms of where we are right now, I think one of the things that has become very clear is how lives are valued differently, right? And we know this in terms of the racialized violence, where some lives matter and some lives don't. And I think it's also true in the care industry. Who gets care? Who has access to care? Who's required to give care? And as Alexis said, those people who are giving care, disproportionately people of color, especially women of color on the front lines, their lives are viewed as disposable, right? They're not given the PPE that they need in order to take care of themselves. They're not given the support for their families. These are parents as well, right? Who are stocking the grocery shelves, who are preparing food, who are working in the hospitals, especially the low-wage nurses, and they're not getting the support that they need. And so I think, if this moment is about a turning point, it's at a turning point where I think the visibility of how, and I say visibility because I think it's always been true, but the visibility of how some lives matter more than other lives has become so glaring and so clear right now.
Yeah, I mean, I have to just, it's what we value as a society, right? And I think a lot of what we're talking about is the value interpersonally, right? How we show up and check in and make sure that care is happening, whether we're holding the space personally inside of movement or organizationally.
Yeah.
I also think there's a whole conversation around policy and resourcing, and what do we build internally as a society that actually demonstrates what our value structure is. And if we aren't lifting that in, everything from our access to healthcare through, the Affordable Care Act, which could be gutted in a month, or ensuring that we have the right living wages for all of our caregivers, and as a floor, not a ceiling. Like, how do we actually build that into our policy process and practice, so that we're literally living our values in ways that that allow people to care for themselves as well.
Yeah, I love that, and just want to add that I think there's also something about, like, to me, care also shows up in if we are just landing at the lowest common denominator, or like policy wise, right? It's like, how do we stay visionary in our policy? Like, right now we're on defense in a lot of ways. It's like, okay, let's defend the Affordable Care Act. Let's make sure we don't lose that. And that's not the bar. And caregivers know that. Like, caregivers know, oh, we have such a higher need than our policy currently meets. And so it's like, I don't know, I just keep thinking about, like, oh, there's a care of education. There's something about, like, care has to cross over into, like, we have to care enough to be honest with each other about the standards we need to hit. We need to be honest about the policies we actually need, and be visionary, go towards the Breathe Act, go towards these bigger pieces of policy. But yes.
100%.
Absolutely. I want to kick back, I think, to Premilla. We're framing a lot of this conversation in the space of society at large. And I think everyone here on this call obviously has operated within a feminist space. And a lot of your work, Premilla, if it's fair to say that some of your work has spoken to how much of the mainstream feminist movement arc, a lot of times has been dominated, of course, by white women with maybe a certain class privilege. It has seemed, at least, or been ambivalent to the concerns of caregivers and domestic workers. How do you suggest that we, as a movement, a feminist movement, whatever that may mean, reckon with that history to become a stronger collective? Or should that even be a goal?
Yeah, that's a great question, Raquel. I think I would go even further than saying that the movement has been unconcerned about issues of domestic work or caregivers. I think the movement has been built upon the backs of low-wage caregivers and housekeepers, domestic workers. If we think about the feminist movement of the 1970s, the mainstream, and I will say that there were multiple strains of feminism in the 1970s. There were African-American women, there were Chicanx women, there were lots of people who were advocating a feminist platform, and that differed to large degrees. But the mainstream feminist movement was one that advocated job opportunities, employment opportunities for women in the workforce. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think the problem was many of those women who were mothers ended up relying on low-wage domestic workers to do the household that they wanted when they entered the workforce. And so the movement was really about the glass ceiling. How do you break through the glass ceiling? Well, the glass ceiling is a glass ceiling that middle-class women, professional women are trying to crack, right? And so low-wage women, poor women, women of color didn't get the same opportunities, and in fact ended up doing the work that middle-class women were unable to do. And so I think at the end of the day, what you saw was greater exploitation of that particular category of people.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think even taking from that, Alexis, I think your work obviously has been at the intersection really of maybe this mainstream arc, right, that has been active, I guess, in the sidelining, as Premilla was saying. And a lot of your work has been institutional in the service of a lot of marginalized women, caregivers, domestic workers, et cetera. And so what has your experience been? I mean, I know a lot of your work has been around finding solutions to different types of biases, particularly racial anxiety, these different dynamics that even show up in social justice movements, though we often don't talk about it, right? So what has it been like for you trying to hold all of this knowledge at once, and in some ways have to be that glue, I think, between the institutional power that can fight on a different level for people like caregivers?
Oh, it's that question just hit me, because it is literally sitting in that space of holding a level of work and expertise and and engagement and kind of the intellectual side of it, but then also reckoning daily with what's happening in our world, our just having to sit in a week where we've lost Ruth Bader Ginsburg. The grand juror, came back and said that's actually not what happened in our proceedings around Breonna Taylor. To sit in a moment where we are really feeling existential at our intersections, right? And thinking about how institutionally we show up in that moment for the patients that Planned Parenthood serves, for the movement that we are part of, an ecosystem, and how we also show up for staff and for ourselves in a moment that feels so challenging. And I think that a lot of my personal strategy, quite frankly, has been to compartmentalize, right? To hold the expertise and to sit inside these spaces and help be a good translator, between what somebody may be feeling, the anxiety they may be experiencing, and actually the policies that need to shift. And I totally agree with Adrian. I think our policies aren't just exactly, what exists on the table or is on the book on the shelf. Our imagination has to be a lot bigger around how we think about some of those policies and practices. But literally my job has been to sit and kind of help translate that for folks into meaningful actions that would help transform lives. And now sitting in a place where it's hard to compartmentalize because so much is coming on top of you, and thinking about how, in a privileged position organization, being able to do this. And then also thinking about the impact that is having on, at the intersection with all of, if I look at it through the lens of a Planned Parenthood patient, it does feel overwhelming. I think that really clarifying our values work, which is what we've been doing over, particularly in the last few months of my tenure, and to really ask some of those hard questions around what is equity really worth to us? How do we engage in ways that are sustainable and where we're building the right infrastructure to do the right work? Always keeping the patient and the staff and those relationships at the center, I think, has been a different grounding that's allowed us to move some of the work forward and engage with our partners differently. But it is, what I've learned, I guess, is just to say that my personal strategies aren't good institutional. They're not good personal strategies, much less they're not good institutional strategies. And really learning how to sit in the mess and sit in the discomfort organizationally and demonstrate that vulnerability and that transparency, I think, has been incredibly important. And it's only happened with the help of a lot of outside folks who are also helping hold us accountable. And so, that's a lot.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for the vulnerability right now, right? That was powerful. Adrian, you were shaking your head, so I'm curious what you were thinking as Alexis was responding.
I was shaking my head because I feel like this is this moment where we actually don't know, right? I think it's like we don't actually know how to go through this storm. And I keep being in conversations where we're like, what do we do? What do we do? How do we make sure we can care for ourselves as late stage capitalism falls? and like not stop it from falling, but also be safe? And how do we maintain the institutions that keep us safe in a construct in which care has been politicized, which is so dangerous. It's so dangerous that Planned Parenthood has to be in any worry about what it's able to provide as an offer of care that is absolutely necessary to us, not just as women, just as a species. So I'm so proud anytime I see leaders of these big institutions who are able to be like, yeah, we also don't really know quite how to strike this balance. We don't quite know how we move forward. We don't quite know how we survive this. But we do have to be willing to be accountable. We have to listen to those folks who are pointing the way and asking for more, helping us raise our standards. And, there's always like what we're able to do, what's politically possible, and what we're dreaming of, what we actually politically need, and trying not to get stuck in the false solutions, right? That's that framework for movement generation that I love. And I feel like right now we're in this moment where what is politically possible for our bodies? What is politically possible for what we can protect for ourselves? And how do we not get tied into the false solutions that this debate has us reducing ourselves every day, less and less. We get less and less visionary because we're just like, oh God, can I just stay alive? Can I make it to the grocery store and back? Like trying to preserve some normalcy, right? And I think what you're doing, that vulnerability of saying like, we actually don't quite know right now. We have to be transparent and figure it out. And we also have to figure out, I think, how do we care for each other at a much smaller scale, widely, right? So it's like if everyone is engaging in those acts of vulnerability and then those acts of caring for the community that they can actually touch, hear, and reach, I think there's some clue for the way forward, even if it's not the exact answer. But it's about vulnerability. Vulnerability is a huge part of being able to receive care institutionally, individually. So.
Absolutely. The thing that stuck out to me that when you were speaking, Alexis, and then into hearing Adrian speak was holding the messiness.
Yes.
Right? Like that has been my word, the last year or so. It's just like, it's just messy, y'all. There's a lot of mess, and of course, in a conversation around labor, around care, it's like, who's going to clean it up? Or who's expected to clean it up, especially in our society. And it's women and folks who look like us, right? Come from our backgrounds, look like the people we know and love. And
it's also like who can be non-judgmental about the messiness, which I believe is caregiver magic, right? Like that's what we learn to do magically, is to be like, you pooped on yourself. Wow, you're pooping. That's good news, or whatever it is. Like just to be with the mess and be like, you know what, you're alive and I love you, whether you're a child, whether, this past weekend, someone that I love deeply needed a lot of care and was in the hospital, like all this. And it was just like putting on that hat again, that all the doula lessons come in, where it's just like, okay, I love you. This system doesn't. And I have to find the way to make sure that love still keeps coming to you. And it's messy. Yeah. Everything's not going well. It's not clear what the answer is. We get to be scared, but how do we keep moving forward with our fear, and caring for each other with our fear intact? It's like, it's all there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That not knowing is very scary, right? The messiness is scary. I think we're used to order, when we're used to normalcy, when we're used to predictability, it's very difficult. But I also think, and Arundhati Roy wrote an article called "The Pandemic is a Portal."
Yes.
And it's really about how the abnormalcy of this moment, the disruption of this moment, is a time when we can allow our creative energies to unleash. Yeah. And I love what Adrian was talking about, your dreams, and I think, is this a moment when we can begin to dream and dream differently and dream big? And that feels scary too, to be quite honest. But it also feels that there's so much right now that feels hopeless, like, whether you're talking about the fires in California or the flooding in the South, or, the murder of young Black people all over the country. I mean, it's devastating, but at the same time, it's almost like there is going to be no savior but ourselves, right?
Yes.
And so what can we do? How can we dream? How can we think differently? How can we try to create the kinds of communities that we would like to have? Because they're not being created for us, right? There's no support out there, so we do it ourselves.
Well, and I'm reminded, a friend of mine, DJ Lalo, Loira Limbaugh, she said this during the Allied Media Conference, that we are enthralled with the fight. And I wonder what it would look like if we were as enthralled with caring for each other. And what would it look like if we followed the dreams of our caretakers, of the people who love us? What if we were to center the visions of the people who love us and care for us, and put that radical imagination in the middle? And it was, for me, it was I was like, oh, that's what I'm talking about. Like, I want my grandmother's dreams. My grandmother was a domestic worker before that was how people spoke about it. And I want her, I'm like, what is her dream for her life? What was it when she was alive before, she worked herself and she didn't get the care that she needed and she died too young? And how do we stop that cycle? How do we listen to the dreams of those workers who are giving everything? And in our movements, I think this is an interesting opportunity to say, what do we center? Do we center reacting to someone who doesn't love us, who hates us, and who's trying to get us to constantly react? Or do we center all the work that we're doing to care for each other and keep our institutions alive? Like, how do we keep Planned Parenthood alive no matter what happens November 3rd? How do we keep those who care for us, how do we now care for them no matter what these buffoons do? Because there's a lot of buffoons.
Absolutely. There are too many.
It's a mess. That's a mess too. That's a different kind of mess. Like, what is this?
So one thing I'm thinking of, and I think that there's a beautiful connection in particular between both Premilla, your work, and in your work, Adrian, as writers, because Premilla, you are very much constantly looking at history, and there's something interesting about that as a generative force for what we may think of as new solutions, right? But really they're uncovering solutions that have always been there. Similarly with Adrian, particularly in your approach at the scholarship of Octavia Butler's career. And if you don't know Octavia Butler, please Google her. She
read it all. Read everything.
I talk about her in the present, right? Because that's so much in line with who she was as a speculative fiction writer, and so much more than that. But it's interesting, you look at her work and the scholarship that you do around her work, and there's a play with time because you're looking at history, and she was writing so much about really the near future and now. Exactly. Yes. So I'm thinking about stories in history that bring you all joy. And this is a question to all of you, right? Like, what are those stories? Is there one story from history that brings you joy? And it can be in the frame of this conversation, but we can be expansive about it. And Alexis, I want to put you in the hot seat.
I'm really connected to what Adrian was saying about her my grandmother was also a domestic worker, and again, there was no language for it, but the story about her that gives me joy is the fact that when she was born to sharecroppers, then at the time, knew she wanted a better life, wanted to elope. Father said no, so she already didn't control her own body, right? Didn't control her own life. She jumped on a train with her fiance, got up to the Northeast, had these long braids that were always celebrated in her family. She cut them off and she shipped him back to her father, and that was like her opening salvo of "I'm free."
Wow.
And she always carried that spirit. And that's the story that was passed down to my mom and to my sisters. You know, I have 3 sisters that I tell my girls that is a, and even as gendered as it is, passing it down through that lineage, it is so important, only because we only make girls. So it's not my, I don't have any brothers. But it is really important of like how that animating idea has woven itself through all of the, you know, the stories of our own power and empowerment, right? That thinking about the ways and even in the which she organized as an, again, it wasn't called organizing back then. It was just like, you know, sitting around the kitchen table with her fellow, you know, co-workers, talking about the things that they needed to change at the hotel that they were working at, things they need to change at the, you know, that the conditions. It that to me, that personal storytelling is, I think, what not only gives me the mission grounding of that I wear this hat, you know, institutionally and personally, to make sure that you know, our own self-determination, our own bodily autonomy is what will continue to drive the movement and our freedom. But I also say it as like the ways we tell our stories about how we fight to control our bodies is also what gives us joy and power in that moment too. And so I mean, I hadn't thought about Grandma Carrie in a second, but as soon as Adrian said that, it all came flooding in, because it's in our DNA, literally.
Yes.
Thank you, Grandma Carrie.
Now I'm like,
So I just want to say thank you both for sharing the stories of your grandmother. My grandmother was also a domestic worker, but I say thank you because I think it's always important to see our own histories, our own stories, the stories of our grandmothers and our grandfathers as part of history, right? As a historian, I believe very strongly in that. And, you know, my work as a historian has been about uncovering stories like your grandmothers, right? Women who, you know, never believed there would be books written about them, but who had a really powerful impact on shaping history. And so there was one story one woman that I wrote about in my book about domestic workers named Georgia Gilmore, who was a woman who lived in Montgomery, Alabama in the 1950s. And she was a domestic worker. She actually began to wage her own one-woman boycott against the Montgomery bus system before Rosa Parks became famous. And when the boycott started, she got together with other domestic workers and decided to raise money. So they sold chicken dinners, they sold pies, they sold cakes, and they raised hundreds of dollars. And they would go to the Monday night mass meetings and donate the money to the Montgomery Improvement Association. She eventually formed something called the Club from Nowhere, which was made up of domestic workers in support of the boycott. And it's women like Georgia Gilmore, who we don't read about in our history books. They were the power behind the mass social movements. They were the ones who made the social change. And I just think it's always important for us to remember that it's ordinary people, right? It's people like people who are watching this, like people who are on this panel, who are the ones who I think in the long term are gonna be the change that we want to see.
I think that's right. I think, you know, we find leadership in everyday experiences. And I think the leadership that comes in, you know, from our caregivers who are living at the intersection of the everyday experience and, you know, in taking care, I think is so powerful. How do we lift those voices up into, you know, into reimagining policy, into reimagining power, I think is a really important question for us.
yeah. And I think there's so much about making it visible, all the parts that it takes to actually create lasting change. Like forever, I say, there's no social change that has happened without direct action. Like massive changes happen with direct action. But I think unveiling, you know, visibilizing the fact that, and no impactful direct action happens without the care workers at every aspect of it. Taking care of, you know, boycotts mean a ton of care has to happen. A general strike requires a ton of horizontal care for each other, and everyone taking it on is like, this is part of our work. There are warriors in a lot of different ways. But story-wise, you know, of course, my grandmother is right there, and I think of her, she had 7 children, and she was a domestic worker, but she always had a freezer full of pops, frozen pops available, and all the kids in the neighborhood knew that they could come and they could get pops, which in my head lodged as like, there's no condition in which you can't be caring and abundant with your care. Even if you have almost nothing, you can get the 25-cent pops, and you can be an abundant source of care for kids who otherwise might not have access to something fun, something summer, something delightful. But I also think of Harriet Tubman, because she's always there too, on the other shoulder. It's like grandmother, Harriet Tubman, Octavia Butler, the trifecta. So in Harriet Tubman, I think about her and her epilepsy, and how she had epilepsy. And so whenever she was taking these freedom journeys, she was also having episodes, and people were having to care for her. And I can't even imagine, you know, what the conversations were like if she was like, let me explain everything that's going on, you know, because now it's like, even with years of share your access needs, we still struggle so much to actually name the kind of care we need, to name the kind of love we need. And I'm like, in that time, how safe was it even to ask for care? And yet people took care of her when she had these episodes, when she had these fits. And I think about our movements now, like, are we prepared to care for our leaders in their most vulnerable state, and not just when they are giving us, you know, what we expect from a leader, when they're showing up the way we want them to. And I really want to uplift Elandria Williams, who passed last week, because she was such a beautiful model to so many of us of what it looks like to be caring inside of movement, caring for ourselves, caring for our needs, and caring in conflict, like caring no matter what, you know. So many of the stories about her are about the ways that so many stories about them were the ways that they continue to extend care, even when they were upset, even when they were hurting, even when they had a serious disagreement. And I'm like, how do we model that kind of care? How do we embody that kind of care? Which I think is, yes, ancient, knowing, projected into a future of what we need to return to and evolve into.
Mm-hmm.
Wow. Thank you all. I'm just taking a second just to receive.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that was so good. So I want to make a quick announcement. It's so weird to have to pull out of that really quickly, but I wanted to make a quick announcement. So folks are already sharing amazing questions. We will be moving into a Q&A portion in about 15 minutes. We'll be flexible. So if you have any amazing questions, or maybe even not that amazing, right? You're just
only like, amazing questions. Now you set the bar. Let's just stay there.
Right. Feel free to drop them in the chat if you can, and we will be tackling some of those soon. Again, thank you all for sharing that, you know, the hardness, but also the hopefulness and the warmth and all of the anecdotes and people that you brought up. I want to kick it, and this might get us a little, you know, back into the deep end again. So Premilla, I'm going to kick this one to you. As always, anyone can chime in. So you have said, and this quote stuck out to me in going back over your work, and you said, paid household labor, like slavery, is rooted in exploitation. It's an occupation where one is forced to care. Right. And I think, you know, to an outsider listening to this conversation and us talking about care, you know, I think maybe we haven't touched on that piece of it, right? That oftentimes most times that care is not a choice, especially in an occupational sense. But given the history of labor in the United States, is it possible, in your opinion, or even, you know, just really with your scholar hat on, to have a truly ethical approach to caregiving in a capitalist society?
The short answer to your question is yes, it is possible. But I'll back up a little bit and I'll explain what I meant by that quote. And that is, I think very often when people hire domestic workers in their homes, when they hire nannies, they assume that a central motivation for that worker is care. And we might even assume it of the nurses who are taking care of us in a hospital. This person is doing this because they care. We want to believe that. It's not just that we want to believe that the person who's taking care of our child, who we are paying money to, is taking care of our child because they care. And quite honestly, that's rarely true. They might care. They might care about the child. They might care about you. They might care about the family they work for. But they're not doing this job because they care. They're doing this. You probably feed your child because I feed my child because I care. I do. But I don't expect that a worker is feeding my child because they care. A worker is feeding my child because they need that money, because they need a job. And so I think it's very important that we not impose our notions and expectations of care onto people who are doing this work as a job, as an occupation. Because I think what happens is that the language of care actually eclipses the idea that these are workers who have rights, that they are entitled to an 8-hour workday. They are entitled to a lunch break. Even if that child is screaming and needs somebody during their lunch break, it's not incumbent upon them to not take their lunch break. But we often expect that of quote unquote care workers. Workers are often expected to go above and beyond the call of duty, to work overtime because somebody needs them. And so I think we really have to disentangle that. And we have to understand this not as work that's being done because somebody cares. It's work that's being done because somebody needs a job. That doesn't mean it's not possible to have an ethical relationship, right? I mean, we could talk about whether or not capitalist relationships are ever ethical, right? And I don't actually think they are, but given the framework that we're working under right now, is it possible? Of course. You can, in the same way that any job under capitalism is an ethical job. People deserve to be paid, I would not just say minimum wage, a living wage. They deserve to have health insurance. They deserve to have overtime pay. They deserve to have Social Security. They deserve to have all of the things that we in our modern day society have come to associate with a decent, well-paying job.
Thank you. I want to, we're gonna stay on this heavy train right now. And Alexis, I want to jump to you because I feel like we can't have this conversation about care and particularly about health and the systems that we are surrounded by without talking about the recent news, of course, of the forced hysterectomies on detained immigrants by ICE. And so for many, I think, or most really, even I think folks who have been pretty understanding of what is going on in ICE facilities, this may have been, a shocking revelation to them. But what are some of the ways that you think in general, our society should be showing up better to support, to consider folks caught up in the crimmigration system, right? So obviously ICE and the immigration system itself, and of course, thinking largely as well about, the prison industrial complex too. What are some ways that we should be showing up, particularly in that current conversation around care and healthcare and access and forced access?
Yeah, I mean, it's just such a painful reminder. I think sometimes we have these conversations as if they were like, they happened, like our their grandparents' generation experiences, or it happened before, 1973, or it happened, in some, like the idea that people are still experiencing forced sterilization or forced through forced hysterectomies, like literally your uterus being stolen from you without you being told, is something that is, and I guess I need to get inside of Adrian's brain, because, somewhere between Harriet Tubman and Octavia Butler, they're still in this conversation. Like, this is actually what's happening right now. Like, wake up. It is, it's horrific. It's unconscionable. And as an organization like Planned Parenthood, that is, I think a critical part of a public health infrastructure that exists to fill a gap, because we have no social contract, right? Even like, capitalism aside, we don't have a social contract around what the minimum level of care that we should be providing as a society to our communities to ensure that we have the basic fundamentals of healthcare and sexual reproductive healthcare available to take care of people. And then you layer on the kinds of organizations, the institutions that your brilliant word, the crimmigration, right, that sit at that intersection of criminal injustice and immigration injustice, and really demonize and further create that hierarchy around bodies, largely brown and Black bodies, that the power of that really sits with us. I think for an organization like us, as someone who provides the healthcare and has provided healthcare to some folks who've come out of the detention center, it really is about how do we lead. And I think this goes back to our earlier conversation. As an organization that's focused largely on rights, how do we follow the lead of our reproductive justice partners who have been lifting up these atrocities for the last decades, right? And how do we make sure that we are thinking about our platforms to lift up that leadership and strategy of the folks who are driving that work. And it is everything from, following the leadership on Hyde. Today, I think it's like the 44th anniversary of the Hyde Amendment, which restricts government funding to accessing abortion in this country, bodily control, to following the leadership of organizations like Project South and Sister Song, who were leading on the fight against the detention center in Georgia. But it is one of those things where, like, if for Planned Parenthood, we center our patients, and we recognize that our patients are living fully intersectional lives. And that means that they may come to us for family planning, they may come to us for gender affirming care, they may come to us for access to abortion or STI testing, and then they leave. They may be worried about ICE going to their job. They may be pulled over by a police officer. They may, be, food insecure, housing insecure. And how are we working in our communities and showing up in our communities in ways that help kind of, do our part to help knit the infrastructure together in a way that really is filling the space of the social contract that has contracted over so many years. I think that's really how we have to show up. It's like institutionally, and then also raise these big questions about what is our imagination telling us about what that social policy should be, and how we actually take care of each other, because that is actually the policy basis of care.
Yeah. So we have received a lot of amazing questions, and I want to make sure that we can get a good number of them in. So we're actually going to start really with a hybrid question, combining one that I had for you, Adrian, and we've had a few inquiries about breaking down what self-care is. And I feel like there's a powerful connection there between that question and a lot of your work around particularly pleasure, right? And the need for pleasure. So, oftentimes a lack of access to care, adequate care in particular, impedes our ability to experience pleasure, and in a lot of ways on our own terms. And of course, considering traumas, multiple identities that are on the margins, there can be even more barriers to understanding or engaging with the importance of pleasure. So how do you think we move to a society that values that everyone should experience the pleasure that, experience pleasure in life, right?
Yes.
And why is that important? And if you can tie that to self-care, even better.
Oh, I think I can. I'm going to work on it. I mean, in one way I can, because Audre Lorde is like a common root system for like all the things related to this for me. But I think the start of it is that right now we're so oriented around care coming at a moment of crisis and emergency. And it's like something has happened. You've been overriding your system because capitalism requires you to constantly be overriding your system. So you've been overriding your system, and then something very loud and visible has to happen, and then you start to receive care. So for me, one of the first radical acts is engaging in self-care, is starting to actually drop in and get back into your body, into your feelings, into your listening to the data that you're constantly receiving from your body that is actually talking about the kind of care you need in a sustaining way. So that it's not, I only give myself care or ask for care when I'm at a total crisis point, but instead making it part of your daily life, right? Every single day, every single person deserves both the care that they can give themselves and the care that they can ask for from others, because they're in touch with what they actually need. And for me, my self-care practices can vary each day, but every single day I am responsible for at some level dropping in, even if it's only for a moment, and listening to what do I actually need? What kind of care do I need to give to myself for my health, for my well-being? That's like base level. And I believe that once you start to drop into that, then your relationship, an authentic, healthy relationship with pleasure also becomes possible, because you're not in a debaucherous, hedonistic, let me just while out because I'm so dissociated I can't feel anything unless I'm completely blasted high or having sex for 18 hours or something over the top. Instead, it's I'm actually in touch with myself and I can feel the pleasure of eating this peach. I'm in touch with myself and I can feel the pleasure of authentic connection with someone that I love. And in this pandemic period, I think a lot of us, our sense of what pleasures us has become very clear. It's like, oh, I need hugs. I spent 3 months of this period of pandemic with no physical contact at all, right? I was traveling. I was away from anyone I knew. I was quarantined. And it became very clear to me that while my orientation has been so sex-oriented, all of a sudden I was like, I really care about hugs. I really care about cuddles. I really care about having my hair braided. There's all these other pleasures that my body very clearly was like, these are things that deeply matter to you. And for both of them, they're not frivolous, right? It's not indulgent. That's what Audre taught us. It's not indulgent to be caring for ourselves, because in a society that has told us we don't matter, we're 3/5 of a person, we are only of value for what we can produce, it is actually a radical act to say, no, actually, my life matters not for anything that I produce or do for anyone else, but inherently, because I exist, because I was born, because I'm a human being. My life matters, my care matters, and then my pleasure also matters, and my coming alive matters. What I feel when I'm completely erotically attuned, right? That I can actually feel what I want and what gives me, I call it the orgasmic yes, but what actually makes me want to move towards something, right? Then that is actually, to me, very politically important for us to be cultivating. That we are not just people that were displaced from where we belonged and put to work, and our goal is just to stay alive. We are beyond, we are before and beyond that tiny, short, temporary story, right? Just as the same way that folks who are having these hysterectomies on the borders, the story of humanity has to be beyond this temporary horror. And we have to keep evolving past the temporary horrors. We have to keep seeing ourselves as something beyond, before, and bigger than what these very small-minded people want for us. Small-minded people don't want us to have orgasms. Our orgasms are radical behaviors, right? Small-minded people don't want for us to have the pleasure of family and being able to care for each other. So to me, it's all, one of the things Audre talked about is if you have not felt that aliveness, it becomes very easy to settle for self-negation. And it becomes very easy to settle for the bare minimum of what someone will offer you, despair. We're in a period right now where it would behoove those in power if we dropped into despair. Instead, I see so many of us saying, we're still going to claim it. We're going to get out. Raquel, I've seen you do this, leading from a place of joy, from a place of pleasure. We are going to still dance. We are still going to sing. We're still going to look fabulous, and we're going to win. It's all connected to me.
Did anyone else have anything to share on self-care? That was wonderful. Thank you, Adrian.
I just want to say that was really beautiful, Adrian. Very inspiring. Thank you.
Wow. So I actually think that leads us into this powerful final question posed to everyone. How can we help, so this is from one of our participants, how can we help honor caregivers who have played such an important role in our society of the past and also now? And Premilla, do you want to start?
Sure, I'll start. And I'll start by saying there is a vibrant movement of domestic workers in this country and actually internationally. And so I think the first thing for me is to recognize and acknowledge that movement, that there are domestic workers who are speaking out, who are advocating on behalf of that occupation. And I think the first thing we need to do is to listen, because I don't think we listen enough. So I think we need to listen to what people are saying. I think we need to understand and recognize the ways in which they are leading their own movement. I think we can pay domestic workers properly. I mean, how do you honor them? You recognize their labor, you compensate it adequately, you recognize the ways in which this is a profession. It's not simply unskilled labor where people are replaceable. When you get a good caregiver, it's a good caregiver and you know what they're doing, right? So I think there are multiple ways that we can do that. I think every single day, we have to think about the people that helped us make it through that day, right? Every single day, whether it's the person who made the bagel for us at the corner, or whether it's the person who's taking care of our kid, or the place where we're picking up our dinner, or whatever it is, the person who's taking out the garbage from our building. Every day we have to thank and recognize and acknowledge the work that's being done that allows each and every one of us to stay ourselves.
Thank you. Alexis?
Yeah, sure. I agree with Premilla. I think that you cannot care for that which you don't see, right? Or for whom you don't see or don't recognize. And, you know, I just go back to that first point I made around, particularly around intersectional invisibility, and how the ways in which race and gendered notions of caregiving are literally taken for granted in society, not seen, not valued, not prioritized, not protected. And so, you know, I think it is important for us for all of those, you know, it starts with the ideas, right? That we do need to value and center care and think about all of the people who show up and create that value. And then it moves into that, let's say, informal interaction that that Premilla is talking about, the ways in which we acknowledge and see and create that experience of belonging. But it has to live and be sustained by institutions. It has to live by the kinds of values that we are embedding in our society, in our policies, in our formal practices, that are giving, you know, collectively the, you know, the wages, the healthcare, the, you know, the right to live without fear of crimmigration or other intersections with state violence. And so I do think that, you know, that the animating idea that care should be valued has to be driven all the way through to to a place of embedding deeply into our social contract for it to sustain and for us to be able to care. And I think that her point around the ways and some of the questions in the chat around, you know, the movement is building power, right? There is a demand to be seen and to be understood and to be to recognize the worth, and following that leadership, I think, is a really critical way in which we show up and we protect everything from their bodily autonomy to their wages, to their ability to advocate and participate in this vibrant democracy. So I think we have a lot of great leadership out to look at.
Perfect. And Adrian, take us away.
Yeah, well, I'll just say a few things briefly. Octavia Butler gave us this earthseed verse, kindness eases change. And I think one of the pieces that can get forgotten is being kind to each other, but also really increasing the kindness of those who are providing care right now, especially where they might be stretched so far that kindness might not be at the front of their way of being. I feel like I'm interacting with a lot of my working moms right now and other folks who are just like, I'm trying not to curse you out. They're like, because just stretched so far. So it's like, how can we increase the kindness that we're offering to those people who are caring for us and getting us through this period of time, and the gratitude. And every single day that can be a practice. Thank somebody who you know is a caregiver to somebody else, whether it's paid, officially paid, unpaid, all that work. The other thing I think is really paying attention to, there's all these seasons, right? We move through these seasons of abundance. We move through this season right now, fall, and everything falling apart and looking fiery and flaming. And then there's hibernation periods, and then there's spring. And our caregivers have to be steady through all of that. And one of the things I think we can do is redistribution, radical redistribution, to make sure there is a steadiness. So as the economy goes through shifts and changes, a lot of our domestic workers are not in those like salaried positions where they're like, okay, it's definitely, I'm all good. So it's like, how do you think in terms of radically redistributing and being in a culture of, we're not going to let all those shifts and changes leave you unstable? How do we co-create a stability that moves us through all of this? And then the final thing is listening. You know, Premilla, I think you said that, and I feel like it came through everyone today, but listening to our domestic workers, listening to our caregivers for vision. What are their visions of the future? What is it they long for that's beyond this moment? And then listening to their boundaries. Really listening for, what is the edge? What is the edge of your time? I've been trying to listen. A lot of the people who are mothering and working in caregiving right now, I have to listen past the initial answer they give to how are you? You know, it's like, how are you? I'm surviving, I'm fine. And it's like, okay, what is a boundary that might increase the quality of your life right now? Is there, it could be small boundaries, it could be large boundaries, but how do we allow those who give care to us to also have boundaries that they're setting around their time, their capacity, so that they make it through, so that we can stagger ourselves, stagger our energy. And everybody should learn to just on a basic level do the dishes. I know it's simple, but it's like, learn to care, increase your own skill and care.
All right. Well, I want to thank you all for sharing your brilliance tonight. This is so powerful. I encourage everyone continue to follow the work, the leadership of all of our panelists, Alexis, particularly at Planned Parenthood. Figure out ways to continue to support their powerful work. Adrian and Premilla have such powerful books out, of course, and always working on new things. So of course, look up Pleasure Activism, Emergent Strategy, Octavia's Brood by Adrian, and look up the powerful works around welfare warriors and Household Workers Unite for Premilla. And join us next week. We will be having a powerful conversation about people power. It's all people power, but we'll be discussing some of the current movements and gaining a little more insight on the movement for Black lives, the fight for Indigenous sovereignty, so many different things that are happening on the ground right now. So thank you all, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you so much for guiding us so beautifully through this conversation. and caring for us,
Thank you,
Raquel. Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
You.
Yeah.